Imagine walking into work on a quiet Thursday morning. The sun is barely up. The air is thick and humid. Birds are doing their thing in the trees. Everything feels completely normal. You are just a gravedigger doing what you always do, moving through the rows, checking the grounds, same as any other day. And then you see something near the edge of the woods. At first, your brain tells you it is just a pile of old clothes, maybe something someone dumped overnight. But something feels wrong. Something in your gut tells you to get closer. So you do. And the moment you do, your entire world stops. Because it is not old clothes. It is a girl. A young girl. Lying on her back on a slope near a creek. And her face has been destroyed. Beaten with such savage, unrelenting violence that not a single feature remains recognizable. No eyes. No nose. No mouth. Just damage. Just the evidence of something so brutal, so deeply evil, that your mind struggles to process what it is seeing. And she has nothing on her. No wallet. No identification. No name. No one looking for her. No one who even knows she is gone. She is just a girl. A nameless, faceless girl lying in a cemetery in a small New Jersey town, surrounded by the graves of strangers. And for 40 long years, that is exactly what she remained. A girl with no name. A mystery with no answer. A story with no ending. Until now. Because what I am about to tell you is one of the most haunting, most heartbreaking, most jaw-dropping cold cases in the entire history of American crime. This is the story of a girl the world forgot. A killer who confessed from behind prison bars and still walked free for years. A community that refused to give up on a stranger. And a 40-year hunt for the truth that will change the way you think about identity, justice, and what it means to be remembered. Before we go any further, I want to know where in the world you are watching this right now. Drop it in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, and what time it is for you right now as you are watching this. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who loves true crime. We tell stories here that the mainstream does not touch. Stories of real people who deserve to be remembered. Stories that will keep you up at night. Now let me take you back to where this all began. Because before she was a mystery, before she was a headline, before she was a name carved into a headstone in a small New Jersey cemetery, she was just a girl. A real, breathing, laughing, feeling human being with a family who loved her and a future that stretched out ahead of her like an open road. Her name was Dawn. Dawn Rita Olanik. And she was born on the 5th of August, 1964, in Manhattan, New York. She grew up in Bohemia, a quiet residential neighborhood sitting on the south shore of Long Island. Not a glamorous place. Not a wealthy place. Just a neighborhood. Streets lined with modest houses. Kids riding bikes in the summer. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody and life moves at a comfortable, unhurried pace. Dawn grew up in that world. Her parents divorced when she was still young, and after that she lived with her mother and her sister. She also had an older brother named Robert. And by all accounts, Dawn was the kind of person that made a room feel different the moment she walked into it. People who knew her described her as bright and spirited. She had a kind heart. She was the girl who made people smile without even trying, without even meaning to. She was not famous. She was not wealthy. She did not have anything extraordinary on paper. But to the people who loved her, she was everything. She was a student at Connecticut High School. She had just finished her junior year when everything changed. She was 17 years old. 17. With 1 year of high school left. With her whole life sitting right there in front of her, waiting to be lived. And then the summer of 1982 arrived. And with it came the beginning of the end. On the 24th of June, 1982, Dawn left her family home. Now here is where things get complicated, and I want you to pay close attention to this part because the truth of what happened that day has never been fully established. Some sources say Dawn left on her own. That she walked out voluntarily. Other sources say her mother asked her to leave. That there was conflict in the home and Dawn was told to go. The real truth, the full truth, has never been confirmed. What we know for certain is this. Dawn walked out of that house on a warm June morning. And she never walked back in. In the days that followed, her family probably assumed she would return. Teenagers leave. Teenagers come back. That is just how it goes sometimes. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2 weeks. And somewhere in the growing silence of those missing days, Dawn Olanik simply vanished. No calls. No letters. No sightings. No trace. She was gone. And the questions that her disappearance left behind, questions about where she went, who she met, what happened to her in those weeks between leaving home and the moment her body was found, those questions would haunt investigators for not 1 year, not 5 years, not 10 years, but 4 full decades. And the answers, when they finally came, were more horrifying than anyone could have possibly imagined. Somewhere between leaving her home in Bohemia, Long Island, and her final moments alive, Dawn crossed paths with a man named Arthur Kinlaw. And I need you to understand something before I tell you about this man, because what I am about to describe is not the story of some random act of violence. This was calculated. This was predatory. This was the work of a man who had built an entire criminal operation around exploiting vulnerable young women, and who had been doing it for years. Arthur Kinlaw was not a stranger to the criminal world. He was a convicted criminal with a network that spanned multiple towns across Long Island. We are talking about communities like Bay Shore, Brentwood, Islip, Amityville, Bohemia, and Bayport. His method was disturbingly simple. He would move through these communities looking for vulnerable girls. Teenagers. Runaways. Girls who had nowhere to go and no one waiting for them. Girls who were desperate enough to trust a stranger. He would approach them. He would offer them something. A place to stay. Money. Protection. Whatever they needed to hear. And then he would recruit them into his operation. Dawn Olanik, freshly out of her family home, with no safety net and no clear direction, was exactly the kind of person Arthur Kinlaw preyed on. Investigators believe that after leaving home, Dawn made her way to the West Babylon area of Long Island. That is where Kinlaw likely found her. That is where he made his move. He brought her back to his home in central Islip. And what happened next, according to witness testimony that would not surface for another 17 years, was a nightmare that no 17-year-old girl should ever have to live through. Before I tell you what Kinlaw did, I need you to understand where this information comes from. Because the account of what happened in that house did not come from a detective or a forensic investigator. It came from someone who was there. Someone who lived inside the horror and carried it for years. It came from Kinlaw's own wife. A woman named Donna. And what Donna described is one of the most chilling, most stomach-turning accounts I have ever come across in all my years covering true crime. Kinlaw brought Dawn into his home. He looked her over. He evaluated her the way a predator evaluates prey. And then he made a decision. He decided that Dawn was, in his exact words, inexperienced. Not worth keeping. Not profitable enough for his operation. So he tried to sell her. He tried to pass her off to other people operating in the same criminal network. Other predators. Other criminals who ran the same kind of exploitation ring. But nobody wanted her. Nobody would take her. And when Kinlaw realized that Dawn was not going to make him money, something shifted in him. Something dark and final took over. He decided that if she would not cooperate, she would not survive. That was the calculation he made. That was the decision this man arrived at about a 17-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dawn refused his demands. She said no. Think about that for a moment. A 17-year-old girl, alone in the world, no family around her, no one to call, no way out, standing in the home of a dangerous convicted criminal. And she looked him in the eye and she said no. That act of courage, that single act of defiance from a teenage girl with everything stacked against her, would cost her everything. But it also tells you exactly who Dawn Olanik was. It tells you she had a spine of steel. It tells you she had dignity. It tells you she was not going to give herself over to someone who wanted to use her, even when the consequences were fatal. Now let me take you to the morning of the 15th of July, 1982. A Thursday. The temperature was already climbing by 8 in the morning. The humidity in Blairstown, New Jersey was thick and heavy, the kind that sits on your skin and slows everything down. Cedar Ridge Cemetery sat quietly along State Highway 94, surrounded by dense trees and rolling hills. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. Where the loudest sound on any given morning was birdsong. Where the world felt still and undisturbed. George Casey was a gravedigger. He had worked this cemetery long enough to know every corner of it. That morning he made his way to the rear section of the grounds, near a steep bank that dropped down toward a small creek. And that is when he saw them. Feet. A pair of feet sticking out from behind the slope. He moved closer. And what he found in that moment would haunt him for every single day of the rest of his life. A young girl lying on her back on the ground. Partially clothed. Her face, as I told you at the beginning, had been obliterated. Beaten with a violence so extreme, so sustained, so personal, that not a single recognizable feature remained. Her eyes were gone. Her nose was gone. Her mouth was unrecognizable. What was left was not a face. It was a testament to rage. To hatred. To something deeply, deeply broken in the person who had done this. She was wearing a red shirt. And a skirt with a peacock print pattern along the bottom. But the skirt was not even on her properly. It had simply been draped over her legs, tossed there like an afterthought. Like she was an object someone had discarded. She had no shoes. No socks. No undergarments. Tangled in her hair was a small golden cross necklace. 2 earrings hung from her left ear. On her right hand, only her right hand, there was red nail polish. Her left hand was bare. And on both her hands and her arms, there were wounds. Defensive wounds. The kind of wounds that tell a story all on their own. This girl had fought back. In her final moments, with everything collapsing around her, she had raised her hands and tried to protect herself. She had tried to survive. She had tried to live. George Casey called the police immediately. And when officers arrived at Cedar Ridge Cemetery that morning, they were faced with a scene that offered them almost nothing to work with. No identification. No purse. No wallet. No fingerprints that could be matched against any existing database. The summer heat had already accelerated decomposition significantly. The medical examiner estimated she had been dead for several days, possibly longer. Her blood had actually fermented from the extreme heat, which made it impossible to determine whether there had been any alcohol in her system. Toxicology tests came back inconclusive because of how much time had passed since her death. There was no conclusive physical evidence of assault beyond the beating itself. The cause of death was ruled as blunt force trauma to the head and the back of the skull. Multiple fractures were found across her face and across her skull. The weapon used was never officially identified, but evidence that would surface later pointed strongly to a baseball bat. Forensic anthropologists examined the remains and determined that the victim was female, between 14 and 18 years of age, approximately 5 feet and 2 inches tall, and weighing approximately 110 pounds. She had never been pregnant. She had never given birth. Her appendix and tonsils were still intact. Her 2 front teeth were slightly darker in color than the rest of her teeth. And that was it. That was the sum total of what investigators had to work with. A girl with no name, no face, and, as far as anyone knew, no one waiting for her to come home. Or so they thought. What happened next is something that had never been done before in the entire history of American law enforcement. Lieutenant Eric Crane of the Blairstown Police Department was among the first officers to respond to the scene that morning. He stood over this nameless girl in this quiet New Jersey cemetery and he made a decision that would change everything. He was not going to let her be forgotten. He was not going to let her become just another unidentified body in a drawer somewhere, a case number, a statistic. He gave her a name. He called her Princess Doe. He explained later that he wanted to give her dignity. He wanted to give her some kind of personality, some kind of identity, even if he did not know who she really was. She had no face. She had no name. But she would have something. And that something would go on to make history. Crane pushed hard to get the case into the media. Newspapers ran the story. Television stations picked it up. Composite sketches depicting what the girl might have looked like were created by forensic artists and distributed all across the country. Photographs of her distinctive clothing were published widely. And then something truly unprecedented happened. Princess Doe became the very first unidentified person in American history to be entered into the National Crime Information Center database. FBI Director William Webster himself personally authorized the entry on the 30th of June, 1983. This was a landmark moment in American law enforcement history. It fundamentally changed the way the country handled cases involving unidentified victims. It set a precedent that would go on to help identify countless other John and Jane Does across the nation for decades to come. And it all started with one officer who refused to let one girl be forgotten. But despite all the media coverage, despite the composite sketches, despite the national database entry, despite the attention, nobody came forward. Nobody picked up a phone and said, "That is my daughter. That is my sister. That is the girl I went to school with." The silence was absolutely deafening. And it lasted for years. Tips did come in eventually. Hundreds of them. And one of the earliest and most promising came from a woman named Anne-Marie Latimer. After seeing photographs of the victim's distinctive clothing published in a local newspaper, Latimer contacted authorities with something remarkable. She told them she had seen a girl wearing that exact outfit, that exact red shirt, that exact peacock print skirt, just 2 days before the body was found. It was the 13th of July, 1982. Latimer had been shopping with her daughter at an Acme supermarket located directly across the street from Cedar Ridge Cemetery. She remembered the girl clearly, because the clothing was so unusual, so distinctive that it stuck in her memory. The girl was at the store buying cigarettes. She had her hair pulled up in a bun. And her expression was blank. Stoic. Like someone carrying the weight of the entire world on their shoulders. Like someone who had already been through something terrible. A second witness came forward shortly afterward and confirmed the same sighting. But when investigators went to the supermarket and questioned the employees, none of them could remember seeing any such girl. The lead went cold. Then another witness emerged. This one worked at a local motel not far from the cemetery. She told police that a young woman matching the description of the victim had checked into the motel sometime in the days before the body was discovered. The girl had asked about job openings at the motel. Maybe as a housekeeper or a receptionist. She told the motel worker that she was a runaway from Florida. She also mentioned that her father was a dentist. But the motel worker could not remember the girl's name. Had never gotten it, maybe. Or simply could not recall it after the fact. Another lead. Another dead end. Another door closed before it could be opened. And then came a theory that would consume the investigation for years. For a very long time, investigators became fixated on the idea that Princess Doe might actually be a girl named Diane Janice Dye. Diane was a teenager who had vanished from San Jose, California back in 1979. The theory gained so much momentum, so much traction within law enforcement circles, that New Jersey officials actually held a formal press conference in which they announced that Diane Dye was the victim. They put her name out there publicly. Without solid evidence. Without confirmation. Without running the proper tests. Lieutenant Crane, the very man who had named her Princess Doe and fought for her dignity from the beginning, disagreed with this conclusion. He never believed that Diane Dye was Princess Doe. Not for a moment. And Diane's family, thousands of miles away in California, was furious. They were outraged that New Jersey officials had attached their daughter's name and their daughter's identity to this case without any real evidence to support it. In the year 2003, DNA testing was finally conducted, and it put the Diane Dye theory to rest once and for all. Princess Doe was not Diane Dye. After years of investigation, after the press conference, after everything, the case was back at square one. The beginning. As if no progress had been made at all. But here is where the story takes a turn that will make your blood run cold. Because while investigators were chasing dead ends and running down false leads across the country, the man who allegedly killed Princess Doe was already sitting in a prison cell. And his own wife was about to blow the entire case wide open. In 1999, 17 years after Dawn Olanik's body was found in that New Jersey cemetery, a woman named Donna Kinlaw was arrested in California on charges of welfare fraud. She had been using a false identity, a name traced back to a Long Island native, to fraudulently collect benefits. During questioning, Donna did not just talk about the fraud charges that had brought her in. She began to talk about something far more serious. Something darker. Something she had apparently been carrying inside her for the better part of 2 decades. She told investigators that her husband, Arthur Kinlaw, had committed multiple acts of extreme violence against women. She gave them details about 2 specific women that Arthur had harmed, women whose identities remain unknown to this day. And then Donna revealed the piece of information that sent shockwaves through every investigator who had ever worked on the Princess Doe case. She said that in the summer of 1982, Arthur had brought home a teenage girl. She described how the girl had spent time at their home. How Arthur had tried to recruit her. How the girl had refused. And then she described how one night, Arthur left the house with the girl. And came back alone. He was shaken when he returned. Nervous in a way Donna had not seen before. He got rid of his clothes. He cleaned his car with a thoroughness and an urgency that told Donna everything she needed to know without a single word being spoken. And then he turned to her and said something that chilled her to the bone. He told her that if she did not go to work, if she breathed a word about any of it to anyone, he would do to her exactly what he had done to that girl. Let that sit with you for a moment. This man murdered a teenager and then used that murder as a threat to control his own wife. That is the kind of man we are talking about. But the story gets even more disturbing. In a separate interview, Donna recalled that approximately 2 weeks after that night, she was sitting with Arthur and reading a newspaper article aloud to him. The article was about a body that had been discovered in a New Jersey cemetery. A young girl, unidentified, whom the community had named Princess Doe. As Donna read the article, Arthur became frantic. His composure cracked completely. He kept asking her what it said. Over and over. What does it say? What does it say? Does it mention who the person was? He was panicking. He was unraveling. And Donna knew exactly why he was panicking, because Donna had been there. She told investigators that she had been with Arthur at Cedar Ridge Cemetery on the night it happened. She said she had witnessed what took place among those gravestones. She sat down with a forensic artist and helped create a composite sketch of the girl she claimed to have met in the days before her death. That sketch bore a striking resemblance to the most recently updated composite of Princess Doe. The connection was there. The witness was cooperating. The story lined up. And yet, the case still could not move forward. Because here is the wall that investigators kept running into, a wall that seemed completely impossible to break through. Without being able to confirm the identity of Princess Doe, investigators could not place Dawn Olanik in a location where Arthur Kinlaw would have had access to her. They could not connect the dots between victim and perpetrator in a way that would hold up in court. And there was another significant problem. Neither Arthur nor Donna could provide a name for the girl. They claimed to have spent time with her. They claimed to know what had happened to her. But they said they did not know who she was. Lieutenant Stephen Spears of the Warren County Prosecutor's Office, who worked the case extensively during this period, found that deeply suspicious. How, he asked, do you spend multiple days with a person and not know their name? The lack of corroboration meant that despite everything, despite Donna's testimony, despite the confession that was coming, Arthur Kinlaw could not be charged with Princess Doe's murder. And then in 2005, something happened that should have changed everything. Something that, to this day, remains one of the most maddening, most infuriating chapters of this entire story. Arthur Kinlaw, sitting inside his cell at Sullivan Correctional Facility, wrote a letter to authorities. In that letter, he requested to be interviewed. He said he wanted to confess to the killing of Princess Doe. He was ready to talk. He was putting it in writing. He was offering up the confession that investigators have been working toward for over 2 decades. And for reasons that have never been fully or satisfactorily explained, no action was taken. The letter was received. The request was logged. The confession was offered. And nothing happened. Nothing. A man serving time behind bars for 2 separate violent crimes against women raised his hand and said I did it, and the system simply did not follow through. Did not send investigators. Did not conduct the interview. Did not act on the information being freely offered. Let that sink in. Let that really sink in. For years, investigators had been chasing tips, running down leads, flying across the country, testing DNA, holding press conferences, all trying to find the person responsible for this girl's death. And when that person reached out from his prison cell and offered to hand them the answer, the system looked away. There are no good explanations for why this happened. There are only the facts. The confession was offered. Nothing was done. And Princess Doe remained a name on a headstone in New Jersey for another 17 years. Meanwhile, in Blairstown, the people of that small New Jersey community were doing something extraordinary. Something quiet and steady and deeply human. They were refusing to forget her. In January of 1983, just 6 months after her body was discovered, Princess Doe was given a proper burial. The community of Blairstown came together. They raised funds among themselves to pay for a coffin and a headstone. They organized a funeral for a girl none of them had ever met and none of them knew by name. She was laid to rest in Cedar Ridge Cemetery, not far from the very slope where George Casey had found her that summer morning. And the headstone they chose carried words that would become iconic in the world of cold case investigation. Words that, once you hear them, you do not forget. Princess Doe. Missing from home. Dead among strangers. Remembered by all. Over the years that followed, the community of Blairstown continued to honor her memory in ways both large and small. On the 30th anniversary of her discovery in 2012, more than 100 people gathered at the top of the ravine where her body had been found. State police attended the event and displayed her clothing on a mannequin so that the public could once again see the distinctive red shirt and the peacock print skirt. Her composite sketches were shown to the crowd. Reporters and cameras documented the gathering. It was a community saying we have not moved on. We have not filed this away. We still remember you. That same year, the case was featured on America's Most Wanted and on CNN, generating a fresh wave of tips and renewed national interest. On the 12th of October, 2014, Princess Doe was honored at a local missing persons rally. Fresh flowers appeared on her grave with regularity. Cards were left by strangers who had heard her story and been moved by it. One card found during a visit to her grave read simply, "Miss you every day, cousin." The world had not forgotten Princess Doe. The world just still did not know her name. And now we come to the moment that changed everything. The moment that took 40 years of mystery and finally began to unravel it. In November of 2020, Princess Do's remains were exhumed for the second time. This was not something done lightly. Exhumation is a significant and solemn undertaking, and the decision to do it again was driven by something very specific. Investigators had secured a grant that would fund access to cutting-edge DNA extraction technology that had not existed during the previous exhumation. The remains were sent to Astria Forensics, a laboratory based in California that specializes in one very particular and very difficult challenge: extracting usable DNA from samples that are degraded, damaged, and old. Samples that most standard forensic labs would look at and declare impossible to work with. In 2021, a molar root and an eyelash recovered from Princess Do's remains were submitted to Astria. Carol Schweitzer, a forensic supervisor at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, explained the reasoning behind choosing this specific laboratory. "What makes Astria exceptional," she said, "is their ability to pull DNA from samples that are so degraded they would provide no value to any other lab. If anyone could unlock the genetic secret of who Princess Do really was, Astria could. And they did." Kelly Keneally, the chief executive officer of Astria Forensics, later revealed the remarkable truth of what they found inside those decades-old remains. The DNA was exceptionally well preserved. The single extract they obtained contained hundreds of millions of unique human DNA fragments. From that extraordinary sample, they were able to reconstruct a complete genomic profile. A complete genetic roadmap of who this girl had been. On the 10th of February, 2022, Astria informed investigators that the creation of a DNA data file had been successfully completed. The results were then sent to the consulting genetic genealogists at Innovative Forensic Investigations, a firm led by Jennifer Moore. Moore agreed to perform unlimited genealogy testing completely free of charge. Her team used the most advanced genetic genealogy techniques available, cross-referencing the DNA profile against major public genealogy databases including 23andMe and Ancestry.com, building out family trees branch by branch, connection by connection, narrowing the field until a candidate emerged from the data. On the 22nd of February, 2022, Innovative Forensic Investigations made an announcement that sent a wave of raw, overwhelming emotion through every investigator who had ever spent time on this case, every community member who had ever laid flowers on her grave, every person who had ever heard the name Princess Do and wondered who she really was. They had found a candidate. A real, living, breathing candidate for the identity of Princess Do. Investigators traveled to West Babylon, New York. They drove through streets that Dawn Olanik had once walked through. They pulled up outside a house. They knocked on the door. And standing on the other side of that door was Robert Olanik Jr., Dawn's brother. A man who had not seen or heard from his little sister since the summer of 1982. A man who had spent 40 years not knowing what had happened to the girl who had walked out of their family home one June morning and never came back. For 40 years he had carried that weight. The weight of the not knowing, which is in many ways the heaviest weight of all. When investigators told him why they were standing at his door, the emotions that followed were, by all accounts, overwhelming. They also collected a DNA sample from Dawn's sister. That sample was sent to Mitotyping Technologies, which built out a mitochondrial DNA profile. The Union County Prosecutor's Office Forensic Laboratory created an additional STR DNA profile. Both profiles were then submitted to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification for final confirmation. And on the 29th of April, 2022, the confirmation came. Princess Do was Dawn Rita Olanik. A 17-year-old girl from Bohemia, New York. A girl who had been missing for 40 years. A girl whose family had never stopped wondering, never stopped carrying the absence of her, never fully moved on from the summer she walked out the door. The formal public announcement was made on the 15th of July, 2022. Exactly 40 years to the day after her body had first been discovered by George Casey in that New Jersey cemetery. At the press conference, Warren County Prosecutor James Pfeiffer spoke the words that everyone connected to this case had been waiting decades to hear. He said that DNA technology and genetic genealogy had made the impossible possible. That without this technology, they would never have been able to give this girl back her name. Dawn's cousin attended the press conference. He stood in front of the cameras and the reporters with a photograph of Dawn pinned to his chest. He said, "This is a very big deal for my family." He said he wanted to thank the community of Blairstown for treating his cousin like she was one of their own. He said it touched their family deeply. He said his cousin was always in his heart. He said that Blairstown gave it everything they had and never gave up. And he said they were greatly, deeply, genuinely appreciative of that. These were not the words of someone reading from a prepared statement. These were the words of a man who had spent 40 years not knowing. And who could finally breathe again. And then, with the identification confirmed, something else became possible. Something the investigators working the Kinlaw angle had been waiting for since 1999. With Dawn's name now officially confirmed and on the record, the pieces of the case finally fell into place the way they always should have. Investigators could now connect Arthur Kinlaw directly to Dawn Olanik. They could place her in the specific locations where Kinlaw operated. They could match the timeline of her disappearance to the timeline of his movements. They could properly corroborate the witness statements that had been sitting in the file for years. They could act on the confession he had offered from his prison cell back in 2005 and had sat ignored ever since. Arthur Kinlaw, now 68 years old, was officially charged with one count of homicide in connection with the death of Dawn Rita Olanik. The charge was supported by the subsequent investigation, by multiple witness statements, and by his own confession, the one he had offered in a letter from his cell 17 years earlier and that had gone unanswered for all that time. Kinlaw remains imprisoned at Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York. He is already serving time for 2 first-degree murder convictions handed down in the year 2000. Among his other confirmed victims was a young woman he knew only as Linda, a teenager he admitted to strangling and beating in the Bronx in April of 1984. 2 years after Dawn. The same pattern. The same predator. Different victim. Donna Kinlaw, the woman whose testimony had been crucial to piecing together what happened, was herself convicted on manslaughter charges in connection with the case and was subsequently released in 2003. Prosecutors believe that after Dawn refused Kinlaw's demands in that Central Islip house, he made the decision to drive her to New Jersey. Neither Dawn nor Kinlaw had any connection to Blairstown whatsoever. It was chosen for its randomness. A place where no one would know them. A place where nothing would connect back to him. They ended up at Cedar Ridge Cemetery. And there, in the darkness, among the graves of strangers, on a summer night in 1982, Arthur Kinlaw ended Dawn Olanik's life. He struck her repeatedly with what investigators believe was a baseball bat. He destroyed her face. He left her unrecognizable. He draped her skirt over her legs as if that gesture could somehow undo what he had just done. Then he walked away. He drove back. He cleaned his car with meticulous care. He burned his clothes. He went home. He threatened his wife into silence. And for 40 years, he believed he had gotten away with it. He had not. Because the people of Blairstown never stopped caring about the girl in the cemetery. Because Lieutenant Eric Crane gave her a name when everyone else gave her nothing. Because Anne-Marie Latimer saw a girl in a peacock print skirt buying cigarettes and remembered. Because Donna Kinlaw eventually told the truth. Because Jennifer Moore and her team at Innovative Forensic Investigations gave their time and their expertise without charge. Because Kelly Keneally and the scientists at Astria Forensics found life in samples that most labs would have declared dead. Because the technology finally caught up with the truth. And because 40 years of human determination, human grief, human refusal to let go, finally carried this girl's story to the place it was always meant to reach. Dawn Rita Olanik was 17 years old when her life was taken from her. She was a daughter. A sister. A cousin. A student. A girl with a kind heart and a bright future that was stolen from her in the most brutal way imaginable. She had stood up to a dangerous, violent man. She had said no when he tried to exploit her and use her and reduce her to something less than human. And for that act of extraordinary courage, she paid the ultimate price. For 40 years she lay in a cemetery under a name that was not her own. But she was never forgotten. Not by her family, who carried the not knowing for 4 decades. Not by the people of Blairstown, who raised money for her coffin and laid flowers on her grave and gathered at her resting place year after year. Not by the investigators who never closed her file. And not by the world, which kept her name alive long after it should have faded. The inscription on her headstone still reads Princess Doe. And maybe it always will. Because that name became something larger than a placeholder. It became a symbol. A symbol of every unidentified victim waiting in a drawer somewhere for someone to say their name. A symbol of every family sitting by the phone waiting for news that takes too long to come. And a symbol of what becomes possible when a community refuses to give up on someone, even a stranger, even someone they never met, even someone whose real name they did not know. Today, investigators are still working to piece together the full picture of Dawn's movements in the weeks between leaving her home in Bohemia and the night she was driven to that New Jersey cemetery. There are still unanswered questions. There are still gaps in the timeline that may never be fully filled. But one thing is no longer a mystery. We know her name. We know what happened to her. We know who did it. And the man accused of taking her life is finally, after 40 years, facing the consequences of what he did to a 17-year-old girl who had the courage to say no. This story is not just a crime story. It is a story about what it means to fight for someone who cannot fight for themselves. It is a story about the long, slow, grinding, never give up work of justice. It is a story about a community that chose love over indifference and memory over forgetting. And it is a story about a girl whose name we now know. Whose face we can now imagine. Whose life we can now honor the way it always should have been honored. Dawn Rita Olanik. Say her name. Remember her name. Because she deserves to be remembered not as a mystery, not as a cold case, not as Princess Doe, but as exactly who she was. A 17-year-old girl from Bohemia, New York, with a kind heart and a bright spirit and a whole life ahead of her that was stolen too soon. Rest in peace, Dawn. We know your name now. We finally know your name. If this story moved you, if it stayed with you, if you felt something while listening to it, then do one thing for me right now. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I want to see every corner of the globe represented in the comments because Dawn's story deserves to be heard everywhere. And one final question before I go. Do you think the headstone at Cedar Ridge Cemetery should be updated to show Dawn's real name? Or should it remain as Princess Doe forever, as a symbol of every unidentified victim still waiting to be found? Tell me what you think. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. I will see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.